You know, the Switch has no real shortage of different grips to pick from to make handheld mode comfortable, bearable, we can even say. In this case, though, one accessory is trying to do a bit more than just make it comfortable. It's trying to just be outright Joy-Con replacements, even Joy-Con improvements, and that's the Nitro deck. And I've seen a lot of people talk about this grip, this enclosure for the Switch when it's away from the dock, and I thought today we would take a look at it, unbox it, give some of my thoughts on it, and also, of course, tear it down. So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. To start, this accessory comes in at a price of $60, but it can work up from there depending on which color you pick, different themes, carrying cases. They certainly have a lot to pick from, and that plays into this idea of a collector's mentality for grips or Joy-Con replacement enclosures for the system. You can even go as far as to register it on an application and it'll track ownership of this thing. Does make me think of maybe these being developed with the NFT boom in mind, and then maybe they backed away from it as those crashed. Hard to say, but at this point, I decided to go with a neutral white theme, as I'm pretty much used to seeing my Switch OLED with white Joy-Con. So, you know, I figured, hey, let's just go with that, keep things simple, which we can then jump over here to the unboxing for the Nitro deck, which on the back, they do go over the different features, which includes things like Hall effect thumbsticks, mappable back buttons, motion, vibration, ultra low latency. So this is a fairly feature-rich accessory and grip for the Switch. Now, opening it up, they do have pretty good packaging going on here, but there's not a lot otherwise. Like, it doesn't come with a charge cable or anything like that, for example. But once you get the Nitro deck out of the bag, you're greeted with a little card that kind of pushes you in the direction of getting this thing registered on the app. I wasn't really interested in doing any of that. I just wanted to see how this would function around the Switch, replacing those different Joy-Cons, which we can take a quick tour around the Nitro deck here. And it does indeed have all the buttons you would need to replace your Joy-Cons in handheld mode: A, B, X, Y, plus, minus, a D-pad as opposed to the 4 buttons on the Joy-Con. You have a share or snapshot button. The home button on the bottom right will glow, which is interesting, I guess, there, if you just lose track of it in the dark. You do have offset thumbsticks. And on the top, you have RL, ZR, and ZL. For some reason, they went with a glossy finish on ZR and ZL. I don't really know why manufacturers or designers are still using glossy plastic. It just feels unnecessary to me for the most part, and you end up with a very scratched up looking surface over time, especially with something like this that's going to be on the go pretty much always, right? You do also have 4 different macro buttons on the back there and a big kickstand directly in the middle. There's a little sliding eject button on the bottom to help get your Switch out. Basically, it just unlocks the Switch from its cradle. And then right above where that kickstand is, it's kind of jutting out underneath the plastic. You have 2 different USB-C ports, one being input, the other one being output. The kickstand is kind of weird because they have it set up to mostly be in a 45-degree angle. It's not great for trying to sit it more upright. This is one that it wants to basically lay on its back and then look up at you, which I guess that's probably how most people set it up on a table or something if you're on a lunch break. And having that output on the back where USB-C would plug in is nice. So you could technically charge a phone, for example, while you're playing your games. And I do still like the idea of rerouting the input on the back for USB-C away from the bottom, which was always a weird design from Nintendo, because you feel like you may want to be able to charge this while it's in tabletop mode. Well, this will at least enable you to do that. As for the comfort level, it definitely is a better experience holding on to the Nitro deck with the Switch in it, as opposed to just the Switch with some Joy-Cons on either side. There's just more real estate to hold on to, and it is curved in the back to try to meet your palms at least, which is something that the Joy-Cons have just never been able to do. And if you have just the Joy-Cons, it can lead, of course, to hand cramping, which is why we see so many different grips come out in the first place for the Switch. The back of the Nitro deck also has this nice texture, just for a little bit of extra grip. The one drawback, obviously, is that your system becomes much larger with this. So keep in mind your Switch, the trade-off is that it becomes about the size of a Steam Deck. That said, a few other advantages here. The thumbsticks are pretty good. They're a little taller, I feel, than something like the Xbox Series thumbsticks, but they still have the same kind of tension. Significantly better than what we have with the Joy-Con thumbsticks that are not great when it comes to travel or tracking necessarily for something like a first-person shooter. This certainly solves that issue with one you'd be used to from just a standard controller, whether it's the Switch Pro controller or Xbox or PlayStation. I do want to point out, though, for games that are going to use both joysticks like a first-person shooter, that right stick is in kind of no man's land depending on your hand size, and it could actually become uncomfortable for longer play sessions. The issue we run into, obviously, is you won't know until you pick up and use the Nitro deck to see if it lines up for you. Things like the Satisfy grip will have a little extra on that right side to give you a better path to that right stick that's already included on something like the Joy-Con. So unfortunately, you won't really know until you buy one of these, or maybe if you have a friend that has one, you'll pick it up and kind of try out both sticks and know from there. I have seen some people say, oh, what if they just put both sticks at the top? And I think that would have been an interesting idea just to see, but in this case, they looked at the Joy-Cons and went with that offset stick orientation just to kind of mirror what Nintendo had done. The D-pad it's okay. It's average, I feel like, but that alone is just better than what you have on the Joy-Con, which are just 4 buttons. And then A, B, X, and Y are pretty nice. They do protrude quite a bit from the surface around on that Nitro deck, but they have a nice press to them. They're not overly loud, so you don't have like a really obvious and apparent like click or clunk when you push down on it, but it feels very responsive. And as I'm playing something like Super Mario Bros. Wonder, which I just played exclusively in the Nitro deck when in handheld mode, it was a good experience. I mean, that is a precision platformer technically, and I didn't have any kind of weird mispresses or times where I feel like the controller kind of cheated me out of maybe a level or something. No, it was perfectly fine. The ventilation on here should be perfectly fine, as well as there are vents on the bottom, on the back, where air would flow in. And then, of course, the entire top of the Switch is completely uncovered, so getting to your game card slot is no problem. The headphone jack, the exhaust vent, power, volume, up and down, all that's fine. I also found that motion controls, gyro worked fine, but the rumble in the Nitro deck is unfortunate, is the best way I can describe it, mostly because it feels very low quality and it kind of makes a buzzing sound, which makes me think that these would be like older rumble motor style, where you have like an offset weight that spins, and even worse, probably one of the smaller ones that you would normally find in an older cell phone of 7 or 8 years. So not the greatest when it comes to rumble. And in fact, I got to the point where I just completely turned it off when I was playing Super Mario Bros. Wonder, because that game likes to use rumble quite a bit. I do want to comment on actually putting the Switch into this thing. So it going in is fine. It's set up with basically like sliding guide rails kind of on the sides with some foam to make sure it doesn't get scratched up much. There's still a chance because you're sliding it into plastic, of course. And then at the bottom, you do have to eyeball it and make sure that USB-C port goes in correctly. It's not something you're just going to freely just slap in and don't even think about it. You want to make sure it's correct. But the thing that was getting me is ejecting it isn't great right now, and maybe this is something they can look at in a future revision, at least from my experience. There is that unlock button kind of on the back that you slide up, and that just essentially opens up 2 different hooks that are inside and kind of grab your Switch when you slide it all the way down. At that point, it's up to you to figure out how to get it out of there, which means for me, I had to kind of press on the front screen with a bit of friction for my fingers and then pop it out of there. So I'm putting pressure on that front screen. Not exactly something I have the most confidence in. I would prefer maybe some kind of mechanism where when you push up on it, it also kind of gives it a nice little kick and ejects it up. Kind of like the Super Nintendo, where you'd push the eject button down and it would just give a little nudge to the cartridge just to kind of kick it out of there, give it a nice little start. Something like that, I think, would help quite a bit here. Also, ZR and ZL are what I would call squishy. I'm not really sure why either, because the Switch can't track travel for analog analog triggers, which I assume these would be just with the feeling. And L and R are tactile, so they just click. You press them and it just detects immediately. I'm not really sure why ZR and ZL are not tactile as well, because that's just kind of how Nintendo has these things set up. It does seem kind of strange, but we'll look at that in the teardown actually now. On the back, there are 8 screws, and they decided to use kind of a weird bit. Like, I had to really go hunting in a couple of my different sets to find one that would fit here. I did eventually find a small Torx that would work, as well as one that was basically just like a hexagonal shape that also worked, but these are not common screws, and I assume, at least based on the one I got here, was just they don't want people opening it, so going with a less common bit for your screw tends to be a security measure on its own. But of course, I have so many of them. Yeah, I was able to unscrew all 8 screws on the back, and they have some heavy-duty clips going around too, which just kind of works in favor of making this feel like one piece, which then in turn makes it just feel higher quality. So with the back off, I did want to quickly look at the hinge, because now we can kind of see inside of it on the opposite end. And it does seem like they're using a fairly, like a heavy duty kind of hinge here that's encased in plastic, which I think should stand up to quite a bit of use and probably a bit of abuse as well. It's basically the tension that you have isn't necessarily going to go out anytime soon, and I don't think it's going to crack the plastic, as it seems to be supported by a good chunk of the body around the top. As for the macro buttons on the back, they're a very basic plastic hinge that will just press up against that tactile button and mostly rely on that for all of the spring and feedback. Now, looking inside the system, it's a pretty standard 2-board setup. So they have 2 smaller motherboards that's connected with 1 large ribbon cable going across the middle, which makes sense. That way they can keep really the center of it as thin as possible, since the majority of the action is happening on the left and right side. And I did want to take a look at ZR and ZL, and once I started unscrewing this, I noticed that these appear to also be using Hall effect sensor, similar to the thumbstick. So basically you can see a little magnet in here. As that moves, it's detected by a component directly underneath of it on the board. And for the Switch, again, it's weird. I don't know, maybe this, in terms of logistics, was easier for them to fit in here and make it work. You feel like it's unnecessary for what the Switch is currently capable of. It doesn't really hurt the experience necessarily. It just doesn't give you the same kind of feedback as R and L, the buttons directly in front of ZR and ZL. But either way, looking at the USB-C port on the bottom where your Switch plugs in, you'll notice that we have 2 different cable runs essentially coming off of here. 2 of the cables are just soldered directly to the board. The others are plugged in, and that's because they've separated the power and then the controller input. Because remember, we are dealing with a controller here with the Nitro deck, as well as the ability to pass power in and then out. And I mean, this is the correct approach. And I saw some people mention that input and output, like, those don't necessarily detect controllers if you want to plug it in. And yeah, based on what they're doing here, they've separated them, and it kind of makes sense in that regard, and also shows why they're requiring you to turn on a USB wired connection for a Pro controller, because that's basically what the system is seeing the Nitro deck as. You can also see the input and output USB-C ports at the top here, each with their own board, each running down and plugging in as well, so pretty standard stuff there. Oh, and looking at the bottom here, you can see the 2 rumble motors on either side, and it's basically what I figured it would be. Smaller offset weights that you would find in older cell phones that give a pretty low quality buzz feeling when you're playing anything that will try to kick off your haptic feedback in the game. And it's unfortunate because I've seen many third-party controllers even do this much better. So that's another thing that I would like to see them work on if they decide going forward they'd like to do more revisions, because they certainly like to do a lot of themes and different color options. You feel like you can also go back and maybe fix or work out some of these issues. But yeah, not great on the rumble side of things, and as I mentioned before, you'll probably end up turning it off as you go. Anyway, now we can pull the 2 motherboards out, and I have to give them credit on this. These are fairly high quality boards. Like, they're very thick, which means they don't bend or flex very well. That is a good thing, because that means that the entire casing would play into the idea of it feeling much more solid, along with these PCBs that just continue to add support. We can see the joysticks here, and again, they just look a little taller than what I'm used to seeing for something like an Xbox Series controller. They're also purple, which is Interesting, I guess, little thing to throw in there, but why not? Their Hall effect sensors, unfortunately, we'd have to rip this whole thing apart, and I'd like to get this back together within reason so I can continue to use it. However, on the opposite side, I wanted to take a look at the D-pad, and wouldn't you know it, they soldered it down. Yeah, it's essentially its own little modular piece that is connected to the board with different legs that are soldered, and I decided, you know what, we're taking up the challenge. I'm going to break out the soldering iron and we'll remove the D-pad so I can get a look at it here, which it's not too bad to do. There's like 6 points here on the side. I just have to use some new solder and then slowly rock the D-pad back and forth, that module, and eventually it slides free. Again, I'd like to be able to get this thing all back together and functioning. So I cleaned out all those different holes on the board, and I figure I'll come back when it's ready to go back together and push the different legs back through, apply new solder, and I should be in good shape. Okay, so the D-pad, there are 2 screws on the bottom, just standard Phillips head, and once those come out, it separates completely, and we can see inside it has a similar membrane, rubber membrane, to what we have with A, B, X, and Y, so it is a bit more, I guess, resistant to presses, but I have to say the plastic itself on the D-pad has a pretty nice pivot point, and it also has little feet on each arrow side just to kind of help press down that membrane. So while I think this is a D-pad that if you're someone really into fighting games, like serious about inputs when it comes to combos, maybe not the best one, but I feel like for 95% of people who see this and want to pick it up and then see that it has D-pad, this will probably get the job done. I didn't notice any kind of weird mispresses or anything going on there, double presses, and again, seeing kind of the pivot point in the middle there, yeah, it makes sense, but it's not necessarily on the level of something you'd expect from an 8-bit Do controller or taking one of Nintendo's Super Nintendo or Nintendo reproduction controllers that they've done for NSO. But overall, the Nitro deck is actually pretty cool. I think there's still a few things they can work on here, specifically things like the rumble. It also doesn't dock when it's in the grip, which means you have to go through the ejection process if you want to go from handheld then to docked mode, so keep that in mind. But I feel like if you're someone who has drifting Joy-Cons and you're thinking, okay, either I buy a new $70 or $80 pair of Joy-Cons, or I get the Nitro deck and get some of the additional features, I see why people are going, you know what, I'll just get the Nitro deck for handheld play. It's built well enough inside, I think, and really the functionality of it, it's pretty good. So yeah, I would recommend the Nitro deck. I think it's an interesting product, and I feel like they have something here if they keep building on top of it. Also keep in mind, they did bring this to market like at the end of the Switch's life. Although, hey, who knows? Maybe if this thing works out for them, they can get to work on a new one of these for the next system, whenever Nintendo decides to reveal it. But let me know what you guys think about the Nitro deck down below, especially if you're someone who picked it up. What are your thoughts so far? Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.